This Thanksgiving weekend, we're talking about one of the best gifts you can give during the holidays, books. Our focus will be books with a political bent.
We'll talk to Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy about his first book, The Violence Inside Us, and how the shootings at Sandy Hook changed his life and career.
Plus, you don't have to be a football fan to enjoy Dynasty, about the Kraft family and the New England Patriots. The author with whom we are talking says he believes the Patriots really were coming to Connecticut.
And more recommendations for the readers on your list from Roxanne Cody of RJ Julia. It's all ahead, Sunday, November 29th, 2020.
From Eyewitness News, this is Face the State, Connecticut's most watched local political program.
Good morning, I'm Kevin Rennie.
And I'm Doobie McDowell. We hope you had a great Thanksgiving, as different as it may have been. Our special book edition of Face the State starts off with Connecticut Senator and now author Chris Murphy.
His first book, released this fall, is The Violence Inside Us. Welcome, Senator.
Thanks for having me.
Your book's a broad survey of violence, not only in the United States, but in other places in the world. And the 2012 Sandy Hook shootings are woven into the narrative throughout. How were your political priorities changed by those 26 deaths?
Well, thanks for having me on, and thanks for this focus on great books that people can purchase from local bookstores this holiday season. Listen, I mean, my political career was certainly changed in fundamental ways by what happened in 2012, and I try to be honest about that in this book. I mean, I think I was a pretty serious legislator. I think I was fairly prodigious, but I admit that I was more intellectually connected to the issues that I was working on rather than emotionally connected to those issues. And that changed after the Sandy Hook shooting. And then, frankly, after my introduction to a lot of families from Hartford and Bridgeport and New Haven that wondered, why on earth I hadn't been listening to them prior to Sandy Hook. And so now, I certainly do, eat, sleep, and breathe the issue of gun violence. And I certainly believe that my success or failure as a public servant, in my mind at least, will be determined by whether or not I can actually pass legislation that reduces the amount of gun violence in this country. And, in the book, I try to make the point that, I certainly think gun laws are a big part of changing the trajectory of gun violence. It is much more complicated than that. And this book is really the story of why America has become so violent and how complex the solutions are to try to reduce that violence. But my success or failure on this issue certainly will define whether I think that I have been a success or failure as an elected official.
I think you used the word advocate, that you've kind of gone from being a politician to more of an advocate. Does this put you out ahead of some of your Democratic colleagues? When I say out ahead, I mean more extreme, for lack of a better word, and do some of them resist that?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that that's true, given that the American public, I think, has moved pretty significantly over the past 7 years. I mean, today, polling will suggest that even a majority of Republican voters supports restrictions on AR-15s. I think when I say that I'm an advocate, I mean that this is now a cause that, will stick with me for the rest of my life. And that I also have come to understand that, I have to be a force inside the Capitol, but also outside of the Capitol, that I need to be working with anti-gun violence groups to try to grow their political strength so that I can actually get more colleagues with me in the House and the Senate who support the kind of things that I think will reduce the level of gun violence in Hartford or New Haven or in schools and churches and synagogues. So I think I'm just more cognizant of the need to, not just introduce legislation, but actually organize throughout the country. I do a lot more of that, post 2012 on this issue than I did on any issue prior to that moment.
In 2013, less than a year after the Sandy Hook shootings, the state of Connecticut agreed to give more than $30 million in tax credits and grants to Bass Pro Shops to build a store in Bridgeport that sold guns. And there was silence from virtually every leader in Connecticut. How do you explain that?
Well, listen, I think it's important to understand, what I'm trying to do and what I'm not trying to do. I mean, I'm not trying to stop the sale of guns in this country. I just want to make sure that the right people are buying guns, people that aren't serious criminals or don't have histories of mental illness. And so I don't necessarily, think that our agenda should ever be conceived as, shutting down the broad retail of gun sales in this country. Your question, I think, is a more pointed one, right? Which is whether there should be public dollars going towards the sale of firearms in this country. Yeah, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I guess I would suggest that maybe there are better places to spend public dollars, but at the same time, a store like that, sells a lot of other things and frankly sells weapons fairly responsibly. That's not a place where criminals are going to buy guns. So I think it's an interesting question as to whether any public dollars should go to the sale of any weapons, or whether we should just, make sure that if we are supporting retailers, we're supporting the right kind of retailers, regardless what kind of business they're in.
You outline our country's relationship with violence. What are examples that we have the ability to change?
Well, I do think at this moment that we're having a sort of second civil rights movement, the beginnings of it in this country. We do have to recognize the connection, the long history of a connection between the maintenance of a racial caste system in this country and violence. You can change all the gun laws you want in this nation, but you have to understand that violence has been used forever in this nation to maintain dominance of one set of people over another set of people, initially settlers over Native Americans, for much of our history, white Americans over Black Americans. And so I do think we have to have a broad conversation about race in this country. And I think if we are more equitable in the way that we treat people of color, we are also going to reduce levels of violence in this country, levels of violence that are perpetrated by police officers against people of color, levels of violence that are perpetrated by the criminal justice system against people of color. So I think that that's a really important component of this discussion.
We're almost out of time, but just a quick takeaway that you want people to get from this book.
Well, I want people to be educated. This is a book that, seeks to sort of, in 300 pages, tell people the story of American violence, but also tell them what interventions will make this country less violent. I think there's a lot of people out there who are enraged at the number of school shootings, at the level of violence in our cities, but don't know what to do about it and don't know why it happens. And so my hope is that people's takeaway is, frankly, an education, right? That they become more equipped to become advocates themselves at the local level or at the federal level. There's a lot of just interesting storytelling in this book, a lot of storytelling about Connecticut. So I hope people, also can pick this book up, and while it's a heavy subject, they'll, I think, sort of hear some really compelling stories about some really compelling figures throughout American history as well.
Senator, I think there are probably some things going on in Washington that we could maybe ask you about, but we're going to leave it at this for now, because it was great to have you on to talk about your new book. Again, the book is The Violence Inside Us by Senator Chris Murphy. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, guys. Happy holidays.
And to you.
Thank you.
One of Connecticut's leading booksellers gives us her recommendations for great political books to give this season.
But first, more than 20 years ago, it looked like the New England Patriots were going to make their home in Hartford. New York Times bestselling author and Connecticut native Jeff Benedict joins us next.